I'm David Suddjian. Welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. Bird Bombs is brought to you by the Denver Field Ornithologists. Bird Bombs is a 30-minute burst of info on a focused topic. I'll give my talk. We'll have some great quizzes, a little challenging maybe tonight, and some time for questions and answers. DFO field trip leader Laura Stedman is with us tonight, and she will be monitoring the Q&A and will present any questions or comments you may have to me at the end. So tonight, we're talking about the smallest sandpipers. These are some of my favorite birds. They're highly migratory, and they make these amazing journeys from the high Arctic, some of them all the way to southern South America. And so we're right in the midst of heading into the peak of their migratory season. So it's a really exciting time to be talking about them, about these little pipers. So we're still in the family Scolopacidae. Last time we had bird bombs, we talked about some shorebirds with yellow legs in the same family. And those were kind of medium sized to small. Now we're ratcheting it down to the smallest of the shorebirds. And all the ones we're talking about tonight are in the genus Calidris. So this is a big genus, 24 species worldwide and 15 species recorded in Colorado. About 10 of them are annual here in the state, and there's some others that are rare. So our focal species are shown here, and we have 7 of them tonight. And I've arranged them in size, and you have the 4-letter codes there on the right, which we'll be using to reference which species in the photos throughout. So those are pretty easy to figure out. So we have the Pectoral Sandpiper here across the top center, our biggest one, and the Sanderling to its right, and Dunlin, Baird Sandpiper, Western Sandpiper, the 2 in the center left, and then together at the bottom, least, and Semipalmated Sandpipers. And we talked about Stilt Sandpiper, another member of the genus, the last bird bombs. So what's a peep? We hear the word peep sometimes, and that refers specifically to the small trio here of Western, Semipalmated, and least Sandpiper for us. So those are the peeps, and the others are bigger than peeps. All right, so peeps are really little, and indeed they are. So we also have some rare shorebirds to consider during the fall. And there are some that are a little bit regular that turn up basically every year, like the red knot and the buff-breasted sandpiper, which could occur in some numbers in some years, but it can be a hard one to find. And then there's some that are really rare, like the ruff and the sharp-tailed sandpiper, curlew sandpiper, have all been recorded just a handful of times or a couple times even in Colorado. The white-rumped sandpiper, while common in the spring and regular in late spring, has only 2 records confirmed in eBird for Colorado in the fall. So it occurs to the east of us in the fall, and it's really indeed a rarity in the fall here as well. So there are also some species not yet found in Colorado, and those are listed there on the right. And these are 3 that are probably maybe the most likely candidates, and they all have this name stint, which is basically the old world version of a peep. And so the long-toed stint, redneck stint, and little stint are things we should have on our broad radar screen. So as we continue with our shorebird ID discussion, we want to think about kind of how do the serious birders approach shorebird ID. So you want to look at plumage details and consider kind of the general aspect. And here I mean kind of what the bird looks like overall. For example, a very warm buffy brown on this buff-breasted sandpiper over here. And but you also want to think about status and distribution. We got to know what to expect when and where. This is our basic filtering. And we want to think about the structure of the bird. What is the shape, the proportions, the leg length, the bill shape? These things don't change, and they are great ID features. Paired up with status and distribution, you can ID any bird that way with a halfway decent look. And then we want to think about the relative size, okay, flowing from that same idea. They all have their particular sizes, and some species make particularly good reference species because they're very common and often found where the other shorebirds are. And shorebirds talk a lot, and their calls are distinctive, some more than others, but especially when they're flying, we want to listen for their vocalizations. And consider the age of a shorebird. So the last time we had bird bombs on the yellow legs species, we didn't talk too much about age, but age is more important right now because there's a more pronounced difference in some of the individuals that we're looking at in some different species here in these small sandpipers. And so right now by late summer, it's juveniles that are greatly predominating out there in the flocks. There's still some adults, they're worn out, in some cases molting to their basic plumage, in other cases just with very worn plumage, and they're really pretty sparse by now compared to the juveniles from most of the species. So most of what we're going to look at tonight are pictures of young birds born this summer up north, and really just a few months old as we're seeing them now in fall migration. So let's take the little tiptoe through the status and distribution, the what, when, where, and sometimes why. These are important things. So we see that fall migration is pretty broad compared to spring migration, twice as long, 4 months long versus 2. And in this graph of frequency, of seasonal sandpiper frequency in Colorado on this page, we see that the Baird sandpiper is far and away the most frequent of the various shorebirds that we're considering tonight. The Dunlin is less frequent, occurs a little later. If we look here on the left-hand graph, we see the Bairds being, far more frequently encountered than these other species, such as the Pectoral Sandpiper and the Sanderling, and the Dunlin occurring a little bit later and less frequently even yet. And over on the right-hand side, we see that the Bairds again here with this big peak of frequency. And now we have our smaller sandpipers in here as well. The least sandpiper is also a very frequent species. And we see the western and semi-palmated together there with the purple and yellow lines with very similar frequency and timing. And we can see here the eBird's revealing that the Pectoral Sandpiper peaks a little bit later, has a little bit later cycle than these other species. So let's take a quick look at some abundance graphs of the same species. So that was frequency, how often you're encountering. This is the numbers. And we can see on the left-hand graph that the Baird's is the most abundant small shorebird, 6-to-1 over the least, which is also a very common shorebird. Here on the right-hand graph, we take out the Baird's, and we see that the least is much more common, 3 to 4 times more abundant than some of the other small species. So that means that the Baird sandpiper and the least sandpiper are really good reference species because they are common. All right, so we're talking about little birds, but even among the little ones, size matters. So we're going from the medium small to the smallest of all. All right, so here I've got the average lengths and a range of weights for these different species. I put in killdeer, important reference species, and stilt sandpiper, another Calidris that's just at the upper range there with the pectoral sandpiper, and then ranging down to the least sandpiper. You can see there's a very large range in those numbers going from, say, the pectoral down to the least. So even though they're all, there's that size range, they're all still really little birds. And so looking at some of these comparisons here, you can see the pectoral sandpiper really large. I'm looking at the right-hand top picture, and hiding behind it is a Baird sandpiper, a little bit smaller yet, and then we have the smallest of all down there for comparison. Here's another bottom right. We have the Baird sandpipers, a few of them, and a couple semi-palmated sandpipers. So we can see that size gradation down from the Bairds down into the peeps there. Here's killdeer and Bairds, 2 reference species together. Great comparison. So, bills. In bird case, we like to look at the bills, but we want to see them well. Sometimes with these shorebirds are far enough away, it's hard to see the bill details. But a lot of times you can learn what the bird is just from the shape of the bill, sometimes the coloration as well. So you want to look at the shape and the length. And so I have our little lineup here arrayed, and wouldn't you love to see them out in the field this way? Well, you're not going to get to, but here on Bird Bombs you can. And so the pectoral sandpiper with its pale base, and you see a medium length bill, and it has a little droop. And the Dunlin has a much more pronounced droop, a very long bill. In comparison, the Sanderling's bill is kind of medium length and stout and straight. But look, the Baird sandpiper is a finer bill, also straight, but finer. The Western has a different bill shape, kind of broad at the base, and it tapers down, and it has a little droop at the end, and the bird looks kind of front heavy, right? So even if you couldn't see the details, you might pick out that front heaviness compared to, say, a semi-palmated sandpiper with its short, blunt bill, and the least sandpiper with its short, tapered, slightly drooped bill. So all these bill shapes are distinctive when you're putting them together, of course, with the rest of the bird. So let's take a look at the Baird sandpiper, our most common sandpiper. And this is a brown sandpiper. It has a brown aspect, and it has is well known for its really long wings. The Baird sandpiper has a long migration, taking it all the way to the southern end of South America. And those long wings are what gets it there. And you can see in the central bottom image that the long wings are, this is the primaries here, the wing tips, various primary feathers. You can see some individual feathers projecting out beyond the tail tip. So that's telling us that the wings are rather long compared to the tail. And so it gives it kind of an attenuate shape that's accentuated by its often horizontal posture. And the juveniles that we see the most of now are pretty scaly looking. Here's an adult on the upper left that's worn, still has a little scaly appearance, but it's kind of messy looking compared to these pretty juveniles with their nice scaled upper parts. The Baird's has a nice brown breastband with blurred streaks and kind of a blended margin. The brown kind of blends into the white of the lower breast and belly, rather than any strong demarcation. It has short legs that are dark and a dark bill, and has that kind of plain face look. And notice this pale buff supercilium, and the head is often the lightest part of the upper parts of the bird. So those are a good clue for the Bairds. Here's another brown sandpiper, and another one that I said is a good reference species. This is our least sandpiper, and this is the smallest of the ones we're considering, and indeed the smallest of all the sandpipers. The little stint is just slightly bigger, but it's also teeny tiny. And so the least is kind of compact and chunky. It has short wings compared to the Bairds we're looking at, and often has kind of a crouching aspect, but they share kind of a brown aspect. Now in the fall, the fresh least, like this lower center bird, is a very freshly plumaged bird, a very bright individual. Some are brighter than others. It can be very rich, warm brown. And so it's kind of a distinctive warmth that you can get out there. But some of them will be faded, like the left-hand bird here you can see is a little later in the season and its colorations have faded. But notice there's some patterns we can see. So one of the things that you want to notice is that on the upper parts here, there are these white highlights, I call them. They kind of look like white dots to me. And if you go to, say, the top of this double set of birds here, you can see white dots on the wing, white dots over here on this bird that's facing away, right? And those we can see are actually the tips of these wing coverts, and in some cases I think the scapulars up there, but these tips are forming these little dots that are very distinctive features even at a distance. Here's a least facing away, and you can see those white dots there. So the thin mantle V refers to kind of a white line that's formed, not so obvious on some of these individuals, but here's a part of it here on one side of the back on this lower right individual. So the least has yellow legs or yellowish. Sometimes they look kind of dusky, but good lighting. You got to consider the lighting when you're looking at leg color. And its face is generally kind of brown and has limited pale areas, and the throat's not actually white. It has these brown sides of the breast with the blurred streaks. So the other little tiny sandpiper that we have is a semi-palmated sandpiper. Very close in size to least, but just a little step up. But it has these beautiful proportions with a nice small bill and the wings that aren't very long. And so it has a nice kind of balanced proportions, not front heavy like we see on the Western sandpiper with that. And it's a little bit bigger than the least in this beautiful comparison here by Chuck Huntermark. We see that the least is just a little smaller, and we can look at the bill comparison of these two species and really appreciate the short, straightish, kind of blunt-ended bill of the semi-palmated sandpiper compared to the much more tapered, somewhat droop bill of the least. And over here in this two birds, you can also appreciate that kind of bluntness. Sometimes you'll hear about blob-tipped bill, and that's when you're looking at it head-on. Sometimes the tip kind of seems to broaden slightly. So the semi-palmated always has dark-looking legs, and the juveniles and adults, but the juveniles especially, look scaly on the upper parts. And they don't have very much rust coloration. You can see a little bit of rusty tone here, but it's pretty subdued in the scapular area of this lower right individual. So they're scaly above without too much rust. So here's more semi-palmated to look at. We can see a little hint of rust in this top center bird. We can see that kind of nice scaly pattern in these individuals here and over here on the lower left. Now I've got this one paired up here with a Western sandpiper, and we can already transition to the bill comparison between those two species. And over on the right, we see a Baird sandpiper, and kind of looking at its size compared to this little semi-palmated. Again, note the bill shape. We can't see this bird very well, and it's really backlit, but we can see the bill shape and see that it's not like the least with the tapered bill and a little bit of a droop there, but is more of that blunt shape that we see better like on the bird top center. Semi-palmated, beautiful little bird. The Western Sandpiper we often see with the Semi-palmated Sandpipers. They're often together, and they're both similarly numerous. I think the Semi-palmated on average is a little bit more numerous along the front range. In this shot of Western Sandpipers, we have a couple alternate plumage birds here on the left-hand side. We have a nice fresh adult that you might see in early fall migration, not so much like now. And then like in July, you can see birds looking a little messier. And then the adults have kind of gone through and they're going to be pretty drab by now, but we do have juveniles that are appearing and moving through now. And so the Western is a little bit bigger than the least, and it stands a little taller often than the semi-palmated. Here I've got them together, the Western and least together on the right-hand side, neat shot by Ron LaValle with one least sandpiper among a number of Westerns. The bill is black and it tapers to a finer point. It's kind of longer than the semi-palmated, longer than the least, and there's a slight droop. The females have longer bills and more obvious droops, like the bird on the lower right, I think would be a female. I love these birds in the center. You often see shorebirds are looking up at the sky because death waits above all too often for some of these guys, and they got to keep their eyes out. So they're looking for predators up there, falcons in particular. So on these birds, you can see the little nice tapering of the bill and a little bit of droop even at these odd angles. So let's look at a few more Western Sandpipers here. There you can see that kind of heavy front-ended look and the nice rufous line of scapulars. I didn't actually talk about that in the prior one, but so juvenile Western Sandpipers have a nice scapular line that's rufous colored with these bold white fringes on the lower edges and around a bit around the tip. And so it gives a very distinctive look that you want to look for when you're looking at the Western Sandpiper. You have that drooped bill and kind of heavy front-heavy look. And also have that little rufous scapular line contrasting. Here we have semi-palmated and Western together in the bottom, and you can see that scapular rufous line, a little hard, you know, this is like real-life viewing at a distance, right? And the smaller, slightly looking semi-palmateds, these are probably female Westerns, slightly bigger than the males, and with longer bills. That's how I'm guessing that. But you can get nice contrast there between those two species. So now we're going to jump up in size to the Pectoral Sandpiper, which is a beautiful, beautiful shorebird. So we often can think of them as kind of an analog in some ways to a Baird sandpiper because they also have kind of overall brownish coloration and a brown wash on the breast. But they're bigger than the Bairds, and they have a bulky chest, but somehow still an attenuate shape because of these long primaries and tertials, especially back here, giving that beautiful shape. They often stand more upright than the Bairds with a longer neck and longer legs, and their wingtips don't actually project out very far past the tail tip or about the same length as the tail. I've got the Bairds here for comparison on the lower left, and compared to the pectoral above, we see the pectoral has this nice distinct bib of heavy distinct streaks that have a nice cutoff compared to the Baird's kind of washed out blurred streaks with a blurred cutoff. So that's a real obvious difference. And the pectoral with its dull yellow base or kind of orangey yellow base on the bill. In good lighting, you can see that. In poor lighting, it's a little harder to see. The bill has that nice taper and a little droop. The legs are yellowish like the least, but with the bib of dark streaks and the more upper parts are colored a little differently from the least. So we don't really see those same white highlights to the same degree. We see a little bit there, but often the pectoral looks nice and scaly and has some prominent white lines on the sides of the back. All right, so another of the bigger of these Calidris sandpipers, but not as big as the pectoral, is the Dunlin. And here we've got our size comparison over on the right. So we can see that the pectoral is a little bigger than the Sanderling and the Dunlin, about the same general size, and then the Baird's a little bit smaller. So the Dunlin is kind of uncommon in our area. We do see them regularly. They migrate on average a little later than some of the others. So September, October, even in November is a good time for Dunlin. And they're a little bit bigger than the Bairds and the Peeps and similar to a Sanderling in size. And they have a distinctive kind of chunky look with a short, thick neck And then this big bill that's rather long among the species we're looking at tonight. They have the longest bill and has a distinctive or decided droop toward the tip. And pretty much what we see in Colorado in the fall are juvenile birds that kind of look like this top left bird or the lower right bird. They're very drab. And up above on the right here, we have a comparison with an alternate adult with a black belly and this red back. They were formerly called the redback sandpiper, and that's why. And basic adults, like if you go somewhere else where they don't winter too much in Colorado, sometimes we'll see them, but they're very brown at that time and very plain and drab. So brown aspect, big chunky bird with that big drooped bill, the Dunlin. And some bonus guess here, if you were looking at the gull, trying to figure it out, western gull there along the shore with a whole bunch of roosting Dunlins. So our last species that we're going to look at in some detail before our quizzes is a Sanderling. And I love Sanderlings. I used to live along the coast there in Central California, and seeing the flocks of Sanderling, along the waves just never get tired of that. It's so beautiful, but we don't get to see that here in Colorado. We see more individuals, small groups, and they don't have any interesting waves to run along. But they still sometimes will trot along or are very active as they feed. So the Sanderlings are kind of uncommon. They're bigger than the Bairds. They're a stout bird with a rounded body and a big head. And they generally, the juveniles that we have predominating are kind of black and white looking birds, very contrasty upper parts with a lot of dark feather centers and bold white edges and other markings there. And so you get a nice black and white kind of aspect. There are a few things that are distinctive in the appearance of the Sanderling. They have this little projection of dark coming down at the side of the neck, side of the breast. You see that on most birds. They also have dark at the bend of the wing, which you can see a little bit right there, showing up on this lower right bird that's molting into pale basic plumage. And they have, when they fly, a big, bold white stripe in the wings. These birds are alternate plumage with brown bodies, so they look a little different from what we see. Some of the Sanderlings have kind of a wash of warm color there at the side of the breast, especially early in the season. As we see them later, they're going to get paler and paler. So, all right, we've had a great tour through our 7 focal species, and now you're armed to work through some quizzes. So we're not going to use the poll feature. I'm going to let you look at the picture and make some thoughts of your own, and then we're going to talk our way through it and present the answers. So right away here, we've got something to look at that's wading out in the water a little bit, some shallow water. Looks pretty mucky. I'll let you take a look at it, see what you think about shape and proportions, overall color. What can you see on the legs? All right, so we see that we have, probably looks like a small shorebird, and we see the bill is small and kind of blunt, not really tapered too much, not drooped, kind of scaly above here on the back, kind of an overall grayish aspect, maybe more than any warm brown tones. And the legs definitely here in the sunlight look blackish, just like this black muck. So all those good clues taking us to Semi-Palmated Sandpiper. Beautiful little bird. Now let's try these two guys. So they're all out in the water as well. We can't see their legs too well. We can see the legs of one of them a little bit. And they both look, well, I'm going to let you look for a moment. So if we look at the overall coloration, it seems like the right-hand bird is darker than the left-hand bird. And remember, there is variation. Some birds are brighter, darker, and all that. But looking at overall coloration, we see they're brown. And especially if I look at the right-hand bird, which I can see the wing a little bit better, I see white dots. And the bird looks pretty small. The legs can't be very, I can tell this is pretty shallow water here, and the legs are barely sticking out or pretty much submerged. I see the bill has a little fine taper with a little droop toward the end. And what I can see of the legs on the left-hand bird, they look yellowish. Right? And that takes us to least Sandpiper. It's kind of how you see the birds in the field, right? Here's a nice view, but the bird's backlit. So we just looked at those least Sandpipers. This bird has some similar features, I'd say. So we might consider what we can think about the size of the bird, and we can see that it's also standing in water Get a sense that the water is maybe even a little bit deeper, but the bird has longer legs. You can see a lot of the legs sticking up there. So we think it's bigger than the least. And I think if you look close, you can see the bill has a paler coloration to the base, but similar to the least, has a finer tip and it droops slightly. Nice capped look, and we see some nice white highlight lines on the shoulders and nice scaly pattern on a lot of these upper part feathers here as well. Beautiful long looking tertials there. And so what does that put together for us? So it's a yellow leg sandpiper in our group here. It's going to have to be either the pectoral or the least, and indeed it's the pectoral, a bigger version there than the least. But wait, there's another bird in this picture. We're not going to waste any time with it, but it's a ruddy turnstone hanging back there with the bright red-orange legs. You can see a little bit of the black loop coming down. And this picture was from Hawaii. So you never know where they're coming from, but I'm not cheating on any species here except for that one. So here's another quiz. We've got 3 sandpipers. We're pretty close here, so we got a pretty good look through the scope, and I think we can be pretty certain of what we're looking at. The question is, how many species do we have? So we see that the lower right bird looks a little bit smaller, and it is has these white dots, right? And this bird on the left is grayer in aspect with this nice rusty scapular line. And we can't see its bill at all, but the bird on the right has a nicely drooped bill tip, and so we're kind of putting that together as 2 of the peep species, but we can eliminate the semipalmated because of this rusty scapular line and this nice long droop bill, and the semipalmated in that case because of the brown aspect. And indeed, we have 2 westerns above and at least on the lower right. Neat comparison. Uh-oh, this one's not cooperating for the moment, and it's just not pulling its head out for us. But what do you think here? So right away, we can be focused in on the shape of the bird. Can't see its face and bill at all, but we can see that it looks rather attenuate and graceful, rather long-winged. You can see the wingtips projecting out past the tail a good distance, which kind of seals the deal among our focal species. But let's also notice the nice brown aspect, the scaly upper parts, and you can even see the pale buff supercilium, and that the head is kind of a warmer buff than the rest of the upper parts in this case. The legs are dark. And we got that Baird sandpiper. All right, so here we got 2 birds, 2 different pictures. One facing away. One's kind of crouched, the other's standing a little more normally. So what can we see? So let's focus a little bit on the right-hand bird first, and we see that I would say that its upper parts have a warm brown aspect overall from what we can discern, and it looks like there's some white highlights. Can't see a lot about the detail there. A little bit of a brown wash of indistinct streaks coming across the breast, and the bird has a finely tipped bill with a little bit of a droop, and kind of brown on top, not a lot of white on the face, and some yellowish legs. So that kind of makes it pretty easy for us, and the crouched posture here is partly just the way it's resting. It's not like it's sitting, you know, and not quite all the way down. So this is a least sandpiper on the right? But what do you think about the bird on the left? What can you see that's a little different? So right away you can see they're not the same bird because they're in different settings. Okay, so not the same individual, I mean, and indeed they are different species. So the bird on the right we can see is what, a little taller, and it has no white dots, but nice scaly pattern on a lot of the wing with these white V line coming down the side of the back, and looks a little bit definitely taller than that least sandpiper. So we have the least on the right and pectoral sandpiper on the left. In comparison. So what about these guys? How many species and which are they? Clearly they're small. And if you had to look at overall coloration, it right away would probably suggest kind of an overall gray aspect more so than brown. But they look pretty similar, don't they? But we can see the bills. Can't see the bill on this one in the mud here, but we can see that there's some plumage differences. This bird doesn't have any particular rusty scapular line. It looks a little bit more scaly pattern than the one on the left, which definitely does have some rusty scapulars here, but we can see the bill here is drooped and long. And so that's giving us a Western Sandpiper info, and compared to the bird on the top. Also, you can look at the bill shape and see Semipalmated Sandpiper. So again, notice the kind of scaly pattern, lacking any rusty scapulars there. All right, so here's a couple fun pictures. These were sent to me by Buzz, and they didn't have any information about what was on the picture, so I had to figure it out, and you can figure it out with me here. So this is kind of as we're seeing them in the field. All right, so we don't have a lot of detail to look at, but we can get to the identification. So let's look at the right-hand picture, and we can see that there's 3 small shorebirds, and there's some other blobby bird right here, which is a little bit bigger. Okay, so we can figure out what that is right away with a little orange at the tip, brown back, and the size, and you guys can figure out what that might be. So what do you think about these 3 sandpipers here? What can we see? You can see the bills pretty well on this individual, kind of short, small, tapered, fine. This one looks a little bit longer and more drooped, and we see the white dots here, right? And we see here instead a rufous scapular line and white edges, not the white dot effect. And the lower right-hand bird we can see a little less well, but I think it's also going to come out to be the same as that. So what do you think? Got to, before we show the answers there, we're going to look at our left-hand picture. And so this was a killdeer, of course, the big guy on the lower right, but then we have killdeer again, our reference species. So we know these are pretty small again. And what can you see about overall coloration? How many different species are there among these small ones down here? 3 birds. It's either 3, 2, or 1. Well, these 2 on the left look a little different. They're browner than the grayer bird on the right. And the grayer bird seems to have black or dark legs. And we can see the legs, we can't see them very well, but we can see that they are a light tone. And again, we can see white dots on the upper parts here, a little less distinctly on this bird, which is a little drabber. All right, so what do we got? On the left-hand picture here, we've got the killdeer standing above 2 least sandpipers and semi-palmated sandpiper. And on the right, least sandpiper with 2 westerns and the killdeer that we mentioned. So great little challenge there, kind of real life through the scope. All right, so there we go. Answers up. And we've come to the end of our Bird Bombs, the Little Pipers. I'd like to give a big thank you to the various contributors. A number of people also contributed photos that I might not have used tonight, but the people listed there here on this page, really grateful for your contributions, for sharing your pictures. If you'd like to be a Bird Bombs photo contributor, it's really easy, especially if you have photos in eBird. I can access them very easily with your permission so that I can use them. And here's a final quiz to consider. What species is this that we have lifting out of the water in this beautiful picture by George Ho? What do you think? Leg color, bill shape, size, overall aspect takes us to least sandpiper. So you can view past bird bombs, exploded bird bombs, on dfobirds.org webpage. Go to our programs and events page and click on the past programs, and it will take you to all the past bird bombs that have already exploded. And our next bird bombs is coming up in just a few weeks, September 8th, 7 p.m., and we're going to talk about fall sparrows. So we're heading into fall land bird migration, and sparrows are always a challenge. So you want to tune in then for the fall sparrows. And of course, you can watch all the past bird bombs on our webpage after the fact. And this one should be up hopefully within a couple days. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And Laura, if you're there, we're ready for any questions we might have.
Sure, yeah, thanks, David. We do have a couple of questions. First up, and if you do have a question for David, there's a Q&A feature here, and I'll be keeping an eye on that, as well as the chat if you want to send me a question. Do you recommend, so just a couple of weeks ago, we had our bird bomb about shorebirds with yellow legs. And we talked a little bit about some places to go this fall to look for those birds. Do you recommend similar places for these birds? Where should we be heading out, over the next couple of weeks to look for these?
Yeah, so you want to find, basically it's the same places because shorebirdy places are shorebirdy places and they have the food the birds like. And so some of the key places still are like Pruitt Reservoir, Jackson Reservoir, and there's a lot of places along the Front Range from Larimer County down into El Paso County if they're not dry, which a lot of places are right now, and we don't want them to be too full because you want to have a muddy margin. So another place to think about in addition to like reservoir edges would be places like at Cherry Creek State Park or Chatfield State Park, where you have creeks coming in, and the deltas of those creeks have nice muddy substrates that these little sandpipers really like. So those are good places to look.
Awesome. I can't wait to get out there and look for some. Let's see. We've got a question here about Jackson Reservoir. Jackson Reservoir is pretty big. Do you have any tips of, if we're going out to Jackson,
Going to Jackson, that's a Johnny Cash song.
Yeah, going to Jackson.
One tip is to, if you have opportunities to link up with a group, and DFO has a field trip going out there with Joey Kellner, still space available on the 28th of August in just a little bit. And I believe that he'll be visiting Jackson. So that's a great way to get cued into that very question, how best to visit some of these places. I know that at Jackson, I haven't been there yet this season myself, but I know that a good place to consider is along the northern shore, which you access from the northeastern portion or area of the reservoir. So we won't get into the details, but that northern shore, which is far away from the swim beach, like it's a whole other world. So you have to consider, it's a great question. You have to consider when you get out there, I'm there and I don't see much of anything going on here. You can see a few things down the swim beach, often not so much, but get out to some other areas as you can explore around and poke around into different places.
Yeah, awesome. We talked a lot about bill shape, coloration, overall size tonight. Are there any behavioral differences for some of these shorebirds to watch out for, or do they all kind of behave similarly?
So I would say with this particular group, the differences are subtle. Because they're all small and down in a similar range. And we don't have any, as I'm thinking of anything that strikes me like the bobbing rear end of a spotted sandpiper or the particular way that that the yellow legs kind of move around or something like that. But there are some differences. The least sandpiper being very small with very short legs can't wade out very deep into the water. So sometimes you can look at the depth, or the least like to be up on the shoreline, whereas the westerns will be out in the water. Things like that are good to look at. The pectorals like grassy areas and vegetation in amongst the water. So that's often where you'll find them. So there are kind of different habitat uses that you can keep an eye out for.
Awesome. Yeah. Now I'll be honest, those quizzes were kind of tough even for me. If I wanted to, a few of them, not all of them. If I wanted to study these shorebirds up more, do you have any resources you'd recommend?
Yeah, the quizzes are tough, but that's how the birds are in the field. You rarely get a chance to view them really closely. There were a few awesome pictures in there, and the cameras can really help. And that is actually a good way to study them a little more closely. Sometimes, for many people have cameras with nice lenses and get good images, and you can look after the fact there as well. So that's a good thing to do. I do have a book I'd like to recommend. It's kind of like a Bird Bomb's Atomic Blast version for shorebirds, and that's called the Shorebird Guide. I don't know if it can be seen real well, maybe not. Pull it back to my focus, but it's the Shorebird Guide by Michael O'Brien, Richard Crossley, and Kevin Carlson. It's from 2008, so it's 14 years old now, but it's based on photos, and it kind of goes through the intuitive kind of approach that we were just doing. And so that's a great resource.
Well, what was the name of it again?
The Shorebird Guide.
The Shorebird Guide.
Can you put it right in front of your face? So you're blurring your background, so the book is blurred. There you go. That's better.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. So this is it's a fun book because he also has a lot of pictures where they will just ask questions like, what do you see here? So it's
cool. Let's see. One last question. You mentioned a little bit, we talked about the relative size of the different species. You mentioned a little bit about I think you mentioned like females versus males being slightly different size. Is there much variation in size within species? Is it sexual dimorphism, just general variation, or is relative size a generally like safe sort of thing to use when you're out there in the field?
So it's generally safe, but where you want to be thinking about it in some detail is when you're considering a rare species. So believe me, when the redneck stint gets reported out at Pruitt on Joey's field trip on the 28th, we're going to be looking in a lot of detail at its size compared to the Westerns and semi-palmated and other things too that we didn't talk about at all tonight. So it can be really important in those kind of situations. But in general, it holds really consistent. You just have to consider that sometimes there are birds that are on the small end of the scale or on the bigger end of the scale. And usually, though, the other clues will be helping you out at the same time with the shape of the bill, for example. But the Western Sandpiper, the females do have noticeably larger bills. And when you see a flock together, you can look to see, does this bill look a little bit longer than that bill? They both have that same kind of droop shape, but you can see those kind of differences. The one species out of our focal group that has a big difference really is the Pectoral Sandpiper. The males are quite a bit bigger than the females. It's related to their breeding strategy, and they have elaborate displays where the males puff up air sacs in their chests. And so the males are actually bigger, broader chested, have bigger pectoral muscles. And so there's a fair amount of size difference there. And you can discern that in the field as well. And, sometimes at a distance and poor lighting, you want to be thinking about those kind of things, always thinking about it, But size is a good general tool for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, David. I think that's it for the questions tonight.